Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks for inviting me here. I'm sure it's going to be an interesting day. I'm just going to give you a bit of a background to how we're doing things in the civil service. The first thing I should say is that I'm not an expert, and I'm not going to pretend to be an expert. This is just the approach as we're handling it in the civil service. And you can see the key things I'm going to talk about. We've got an idea of what we want to do. We've introduced a civil service-wide survey. I'll talk a bit about that. I'll give you a flavour of some of the results we found when looking at engagement across the civil service and some of the things we're doing to support departments and organisations in the civil service to try and take this forward. But I should make the point, I think, at that stage that I feel that what we've done is largely transactional at this stage. We've put some things in place. I wouldn't say we've yet got to the point where we're making transformational change, and some of the things Nita talked about are some of the challenges that we're facing, which I'll also talk a little bit about. But my point about not being an expert is that in addition to being responsible for a number of things, this one of them in the civil service, I'm also a manager and a leader, I suppose. And I have to say that personally, despite my involvement in this kind of program, I still find this thing tough. And if anyone says to you that this is easy, I think they're either very, very rich because they've persuaded lots of other people that it's easy and they've paid them for that, or they're a liar, actually, because I find this very tough. And it's that very cultural thing when push comes to shove that do I behave in the way that I know I should behave, and do I see others behaving in the way that I know? And the answer to that quite often is no rather than yes. So I mean that's why I'm not an expert. I'm not claiming to be one. Okay, I just need to tell you where we sit in the civil service. I'm part of a thing called the Civil Service Capability Group, or at least it was when I left yesterday. I can't promise it'll still be that when I get back later on. And there are really sort of three key jobs that we do. We are, to all intents and purposes, the HR HQ for the civil service, but we certainly don't deal with lots of HR issues. Most of it is devolved to departments, so it's a sort of a selection of things that we do on behalf of the civil service as a whole. One of them is that we have responsibility for the senior civil service, so we worry about those as a cadre across the civil service. Another is that we check capability. We encourage departments to improve their capability to meet their future challenges. And the kind of third leg of that stool is that we're responsible for workforce issues. So the big things that you would expect us to do across the civil service, dealing with downsizing, dealing with terms and conditions, certainly for below the senior civil service, that's the kind of thing that we do. So we have a very specific interest in building the capability of the civil service, and this is just one part of what we do. Our approach has been to provide a single and consistent measure of engagement across the civil service, a big people survey. We're trying very hard with very small resource to encourage and support departments to take the engagement agenda forward. And by other means, we're following up on that to make sure that departments are improving and we can see how they're progressing. And as I say, that's the kind of three transactional things we're doing. We're still groping for and hoping for the big transformational change. So let me talk a bit about the single survey. Historically, departments carried out their own staff attitude surveys. They were different across the civil service, not held at the same time, asked different questions, weren't necessarily oriented towards engagement. Well, from last year, we now have a single survey across the civil service, and that's been quite a considerable challenge. It does give us a consistent approach. It does give us a single measure and consistent measure of engagement. And by doing it across the civil service and getting such a massive response rate, we're able to do a number of things with the data that we get from that. And again, I'll talk a bit about that. It gives us some interesting insights into the civil service as a whole, which is beyond the insights that you get at a departmental group and team level. And good news in the current climate, by doing that, we've been able to cut the cost considerably of the various surveys that took place across the civil service as a whole. Well, what were we trying to achieve? Well, I mean, I guess, you know, these are all the things that people will say we were doing these things for, and they're very relevant, I think, and they remain relevant and will become more relevant in the future. Clearly, we weren't seeing engagement as an end in itself. We're seeing engagement as a means to improving productivity and delivery, to improving attendance among our staff, to retaining our, the list is there. I mean, these are the kind of things that we hope being better at our game in terms of engagement will deliver for us. So there are real potential, tangible benefits from doing what we're doing. I just have to pause at this stage because I said I would give a plug for a company called Bite Size. How about that? I've kept my promise. There you go. Oh, there you go. There, see? They grab me before it starts and look what you get. That's what I mean. Okay. Crucially, we also see this as a means to getting effective change management, and that's very, very important as we go into the next era. Why are we doing this? Well, I mean, quite clearly the cost of disengagement is very, very high, and it's very damaging. But also we're doing it because, even before, very recent events, we recognised that we were facing considerable challenges in the civil service. And we've done a lot of work over the last 4 years to understand some of those challenges and how they affect the civil service. I mean, just forget about the fiscal problem, if you will, for just a moment, although it's very important. What the civil service, the challenges it faces today are really far greater than they've ever faced before. The things that we have to do, childhood obesity, climate change, the fiscal deficit, they're not easily solved problems. They rely desperately on collaboration between departments, between sectors. They rely heavily on different mechanisms of achieving outcomes. No longer are we simply able to pass a bit of legislation, throw it over the wall to local government or some other sector to operate. These are very complex and difficult problems. And if we've got any chance of addressing them, we have to be at the top of our game. And what's more, everyone we work with and that collaborative whole has to be at the top of its collective game as well. And that's a significant challenge. Throw in the fact that the civil service, before I left the office, was the smallest it's been since the Second World War. And we now have a government which is saying, it's got a problem it's got to address, and will reduce almost certainly the civil size, the civil service, even further. So if we had a big challenge, we've now got a bigger challenge, and the challenge is both in the task that we've got to do and the resources that we'll have to do it. So this agenda becomes even more important. So what's our kind of model? Well, on the left-hand side of this is what we call the drivers of engagement. I think David would probably refer to these as enablers, but I think they're very, very similar. But our approach, and because we've got the people survey, it enables us to dissect this a bit more to understand what the key drivers are. So we can look across that list and understand at both the department, group and civil service-wide level to a certain extent what are the key drivers of engagement, where we're failing on those and how we can address them. Our survey has the kind of 3 standard question sets which enable us to get an engagement index. It's about what people say about our department, whether they want to stay, and the extent to which they're striving to achieve the objectives of the organisation. So that's our very simple model. We have a mechanism, other mechanisms to triangulate what we know from our people survey. We have capability reviews, we do assessments of our top leaders, and we're able to draw a very clear picture of the areas where I think we need to work on. I'm not saying this just because David's here, but it obviously helps. He thought our approach was a good one, so we're rather pleased about that. Just to give you an example of the range of organisations that we're dealing with. I mean, the civil service, it's easy, and often the media portrays us as just the people who sit in Whitehall and think good thoughts which are turned into government policy. It's much bigger than that. Actually, the bit in Whitehall is a very, very small part. It's just under 10% really of the civil service as a whole. And the majority of the civil service is people you'll find up and down the country, not just in London, but in major concentrations in the northwest and the northeast and in other areas doing real jobs. I mean, this is a huge range of organisations, and it's easy to forget, I think, just how diverse a job the civil service does as a whole. So that's a huge population over which we're dealing, and their issues, while some of them will be much the same, some will be very, very different.